All right, all set. Okay, hi everybody, welcome to our virtual class this week. So last week we discussed wheat flours, their properties and identification, and this week we're just gonna get into it a little bit deeper with the formation of gluten and crumb. So first I'm gonna have you do the introduction activity, which is our KWL chart, and that is what you know already about this topic, what you want to know, and for the what you learned section, you can place in something that you either know about the topic already or something that we had learned in our previous lesson that might tie into this one. So I'm just gonna give you a minute or two to do that one before we get some answers. Does anyone have anything initially put down that they'd like to share for a know, learned, or what they'd like to know?
Can I ask? So
Yeah.
like what I want to know is, and this is like something that I have trouble with at home too, is like how long I need to knead a dough to develop the gluten enough.
Yeah.
So like my pizza dough or something, or like a flatbread doesn't fall apart.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm actually going to be going into that during the process, so I'm glad that's something you want to learn, so I'll make sure to touch on that when we get up to that part for you. Does anybody else have any?
I want to know, I know that you're talking about wheat flour, so maybe like the difference for like hydration for wheat versus white flour.
Yeah, of course. So when I speak of wheat flour, I more so mean a flour that contains gluten in it. And the other types of flours, such as like almond or something, that would be considered non-wheat. But when it does come to a whole wheat versus a regular flour, the whole wheat needs a higher hydration for sure. But we are going to touch on hydration a little bit and how it does affect the gluten development in the recipe. And any for you, Victoria?
That kind of goes into my question, as I know some people that are allergic or sensitive to gluten and kind of adapting, whether it's this recipe or other recipes that they see, to make a similar product and how that's possible.
Yeah, of course. I could definitely touch on that for sure as well. So the item that we are making today is going to be a skillet flatbread. And the reason I chose this flatbread is because it's one that you can make relatively quickly. Normally when it comes to making breads, there needs to be a lot of rest time for the dough. So that doesn't really work with a 45-minute one. But this one is a quick style flatbread that is cooked on the stove. So we'll just start with our mise en place here. So for our mise en place, we have 3 cups of all-purpose flour in this case, 1 cup of ice water, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, and 3 tablespoons of olive oil. So first to start, what you would like to do anytime you are making a bread recipe, and this is important for it as well, is you start with the dry ingredients and you're going to combine them together. So you just plop those into the bowl and then whisk them together. So the point of whisking together, does anyone know why we would want to do this before mixing the dough?
Distributing the ingredients?
Yes, yeah. So to distribute the leavening agents more so evenly so that when you mix the dough together, you don't get any clumps of something when you bite in. It would be really disappointing to have a nice, beautiful dough and then bite into a clump of salt per se. So once that's all incorporated together, I'm gonna pour it into the mixer. And then you combine the wet ingredients in it. So we're gonna do the fat, which in this case is the 3 tablespoons of oil, and then about a cup of ice water. So the reason ice water is used is it actually helps the elasticity of the gluten, and it helps build and develop the gluten more than hot water, because hot water kind of denatures the protein in that. And when you're making a dough the first time, touching on hydration, you would like to start slowly with the water just to see kind of how the dough develops instead of just pouring it all in. So I'm just gonna start with just about half the water and put that on a slow speed. So if you look at the sheet following the recipe, there is what is gluten and how is it formed. So you can see on that sheet that there are two main proteins in gluten, and those are going to be the glutenin and the gliadin. And when you add them together with the water and mix it to agitate it, that's how you develop the gluten in the dough. So first I'm going to take this off here and let you see a partially developed dough, just so you can see kind of what it looks like. So this is the starting point of what a gluten development would look like. It's still kind of crumbly, it's not fully incorporated yet, and this is the partial hydration of that dough.
Are you mixing that on a low speed or medium speed? I can't really tell.
Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, it is medium speed. First, when you're partially hydrating, you don't want the flour to go everywhere. So you're going to start on a slower speed, and then you kind of bring it up to a medium speed until you get a cohesive dough. So now that we have a more cohesive dough, I'm just going to bring it over to show one more time. That's more of like a formulated dough. I like to finish off doughs normally with a good manual knead, just because kneading is one of the variables that helps develop the gluten. Can anybody see that with the bottom over there? I'm not sure. Let me see if I can move this somewhere that you could see it. Is it visible for everybody?
No.
It would lift it up. Really. If you can lift it up.
Yep. So I'll just show it right now like that. That's not fully developed. But you're going to take the dough, and you see how there's those dry pieces? That's what you kind of want to slowly incorporate. So let me just get a few good mixes in there, a few good turns, and then I can show you the dough a little more as it gets developed. Has anybody ever learned about the process of kneading before and how it's supposed to be done?
A little.
A little. What do you know about it?
It's more of a motion to describe.
Yes. I actually myself had to look up what the motion was, because I was like, oh, I know how to do this by hand, but I was like, how do I explain that to somebody? So basically you can see here I have kind of a more formulated cohesive dough ball, but the motion for the kneading is actually you do a press, you do a fold, you do a turn, and then you flatten it out, and you just repeat that process. So I know you were touching on the crumbliness and the hydration of the dough. Helen, you had questions about that. As you can see today, my dough is a little drier than the dough I made the first time I tried this recipe. So when you have an instance like this where your dough is a little too dry, that's where you want to add in just like little touches of water to get it to that hydration, because this should be more of a stickier kind of dough. So what I'm going to do is just grab a little extra water so that I can get the rest of that dough together. What I do is
So Nicole,
Yep.
Chef Nicole, is this considered a quick bread?
It's considered a quick bread, a flatbread kind of thing. It's like a mixture between the two.
What would happen?
What was that?
I have to have a quick question.
Yep.
What would happen if your dough was too wet or that overhydration? How do you figure that out?
So you just figure that with actually a little bit of more flour. You put like a little dusting of flour on the top of it to kind of fix that overhydration. When it comes to dough, there is a formulated recipe that you do want to follow with it, but you have to be ready for the variables that are associated with it. It depends, dough's very temperate on the temperature outside or the humidity in your air. So that's something that you have to consider when you're making a dough, that you might need a little more flour than you did the other day, or you might need a little more water than what you did the other day. So as you can see, like, I added this little bit of water and now it's kind of starting to come together more to an actual ball. This dough ball for this recipe, you want it to be a little on the stickier side because it is dusted pretty heavily with flour before it is completed. So you're just gonna pick it up. And I know, Helen, you were asking about when you know you're done with the kneading process.
Yeah.
There is actually a test you can do on the dough to see how developed the gluten in it is. Is anyone familiar with one of the tests for checking the gluten in a dough?
The window.
Yes, yeah. So it's called the window pane test. And it's called the window pane test because you basically take that little piece of dough and you make a little thin window with it. Not a break in it, but rather just a window. Okay, so this dough is kind of looking like what it's supposed to. So that's where I'm gonna perform the window test. So basically what you do to do that, you're gonna take a pinch of the dough and pinch it off. Then you take the dough and you round it off in your hands to kind of create a little window. So this one, you can see it's breaking a little bit before it makes the window. So you wanted to see that it's not exactly fully formed all the way yet. So what you're gonna do when that case is knead a little more.
Does this dough need to rest?
Yes, so this dough, the reason I did pick it is because it only rests for about 10 minutes once it's completed, which is a very short rest time for the dough. Does anyone know why we do rest a dough?
I was gonna ask that.
Yeah.
Like resting the gluten so that it doesn't pull back when you...
Yes. So when you knead a dough, basically what you're doing is you're strengthening and elongating the gluten in that dough. And when you let it rest for a few minutes, it gives that gluten in there that you developed a little more time to relax before your final form. So basically what you're gonna do now is we mix it a little more, looking a little more cohesive. And we're gonna do our little window pane. I don't know if everybody can see the window here. Oh no, I broke it. It's okay. It happens sometimes. So the weather, I don't know what the weather is like where you are today, but the weather near me, it is not optimal bread baking weather. Kind of wish it was the other day where it was nice and beautiful out. But you can see how there's those little areas right there that are thinner than the others. I know it must be difficult to see over camera, but if you look at it, you can see like right there, there's that window. And that kind of lets you know that the dough is ready for its rest. So for this dough, it's only going to rest for 10 minutes, as I stated, and then we will be on to the rest of the shaping process with it. So you just add a clean bowl, pop it in there. This one, they suggested you use saran wrap. If you want to have a dough with yeast and get it to build higher, you could do one with a hot towel or something to make the yeast proficient in growing. Right, so while that's waiting, it's going to be 10 minutes for that. We are going to do a little activity on factors for controlling gluten. So if you go to the page where you have that picture of the original gluten formation process, there is going to be a fill-in chart at the bottom. Would somebody read the first section for me, number 1?
Classified as strong or weak, depending on their protein content.
Does anyone have any idea what ingredient we might use in a flour recipe to control gluten that is classified as strong or weak? You got
the different flours?
Yes, so it is the different types of flours. So your first factor in controlling gluten is the flour selection. So if you choose a gluten such as bread flour, that would have, does anyone know what type of protein content bread flour has? Not a number, just in relative terms.
It's like middle, right?
It's all-purpose flour would be more towards the middle.
Okay. A little bit higher?
Yeah, a little higher. So the the content of protein in there is about 12%. And then there's small flours that have softer, such as cake or pastry flour, and those would be a lower percentage, around about 7, 9, about there. Okay, can someone read the second one for me?
Sure. Surrounds gluten particles and shortens gluten strands.
All right, so this substance is a substance that we did use in this dough today, and it's one that's used in a lot of sweetbreads, and it shortens the strands of gluten.
Sugar?
It's a good guess. Sugar is hygroscopic, but it's not that one.
Salt?
Nope, not that one either. It's more so shorts in the word of the name. It's something that you would put in there to kind of cut through things.
Shortening or
Yes,
fat?
shortening or fat. So that is one of the ways of controlling gluten. Shortening or fat kind of cuts up the gluten strands and makes them shorter. And that's a good way to control the gluten in some of those recipes that you want to be a little more tender, such as cakes or cookies. Those can help you tenderize. All right, and the third one?
Proteins must absorb this before being developed. Affects toughness or tenderness of dough.
So this goes back to forming the gluten in the dough itself, that process we talked about earlier in the worksheet. And it's something that all breads need.
Water?
Yes, water. So that's the third factor in controlling gluten. Like we were discussing, the hydration of your dough affects the final outcome of it. So that's the third one. And the fourth one?
The more dough is agitated, the more gluten develops.
So this would be the process of agitation that takes place in a recipe.
Kneading.
Yes, kneading or the mixing method. So that would be that one. So those four factors are really the big contributors to how your final dough is going to come out. So while we're waiting for this to finish up, I'm just going to set up for the next section of the demonstration, which is the scaling and frying of this dough.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would the flavor or would the recipe be different with a different oil, like avocado oil or grapeseed oil or canola oil versus the olive oil?
Yeah, I would say so, because in this recipe, the olive oil is kind of there because I picked a recipe that was based off of Italian culture because that's the culture of my own, and I figured a lot of recipes, a lot of people have different flatbreads that they could adapt to their own culture, but for sure, definitely. It depends on how much oil is in the recipe too. For this one, we are putting 3 tablespoons in and we are frying it in that oil as well. So you are gonna get a little bit of that hint of taste of olive oil as opposed to something else. I definitely do think it affects the flavor, and something else you need to look for when you're going to use an oil in your dough is you have to think of the point at which that smokes. Because especially if we're doing like this one, like in the skillet, or if you need the starches in the oven to heat up and the water to evaporate, the water in that oil also contributes to that. All right.
I had another question.
Yeah.
You said there was more than one way to test the gluten.
Yep.
You demonstrated the window pane. What else would what other ways would there be?
So another way that you could see the type of gluten formation in it is when you wait for the dough it's like a poking method. I don't exactly know the name for it, but basically what you do is once you let the dough rest and the gluten relaxes, you kind of just poke it, and if it springs back, then you know that it has a good amount of gluten formed in it and that it would be good to go, as opposed to one that doesn't spring back. It's not really properly developed. So that would be a second method of doing that.
I have a question as well.
Mhm.
If I wanted to add any type of like flavoring, say like herbs or something into the flatbread dough, do I add that during the kneading stage or sometime after?
I would say it depends on how big the inclusion you want to add is. Because if it's just dried herbs, usually I like them being all the way throughout the bread. So I would put them in during that initial dry mixture so that you could mix it in and disperse it with the other ingredients. But if it's a bigger inclusion, such as like chocolate chips or raisins or something, I usually kind of try not to do those on the mixer too much because I don't want it to cut them down and destroy them. So that's kind of the thought process behind that. So our dough should just be right about good. So you can see now that it has a little dough. It got to relax a little bit. It springs back when I poke it. Very nice. So next what you want to do is you are going to flatten it out and you are going to divide up the pieces and scale it out. So I have just a little scale right here and I can do that. And a dough divider. So when we divide this, we would like to make sure that it's all in even pieces. So usually what I will do is, since every dough is a little different depending on the amount of water or flour you add, I like to weigh it out first, see about how much it is. So this one's about 700 grams. So I'll do about 50-gram pieces for this one. Does anyone know why it's important to have pieces about the same size when you're making a dough or a recipe?
They all cook the same?
Yep, that's one of the reasons for sure. If you're putting them in an oven, you want to make sure that they all cook at the same time, they have evenness. Can anybody think why it would be good to be applicable in a restaurant?
So that everyone gets the same portion size?
Exactly. If you think about it, it's kind of like when your mom used to cut cakes at birthday parties and, you know, your cousin would get the bigger piece and you'd turn around and go, oh, well, like, why does she have the bigger piece? That's not fair. You don't want your customers to sit there and go, oh, well, we both ordered the bread or like the pizza or something, and why is their piece so much bigger? Like, why am I getting ripped off? And it also helps with transferring the recipes over. You want to think about training somebody new maybe in your establishment, and it helps with your quality and your consistency. You want your dough and you want your recipe to come out the same no matter who's making it. So making sure that you have a set size for them can help with that. Okay, so I'm gonna take the rest of the dough and put it over here. We got 1, 2, 3, about 7 pieces that we are going to use in the rest of the demonstration. All right. So when you are doing these, I'm going to do it over here so you can kind of see it as well, that you want to make sure that you roll them out to about 1/4 of an inch thickness, just so they go nice in the skillet and they cook properly. So I'm going to move all those bad boys over here, and I'm just going to do that. So these doughs, they're more of like a rustic type of dough. So the shape is a little, when you think of like a naan bread, where the shape is a little irregular and a little more rustic looking, that's the kind of look that you're going for in these. So as you can see, rolled out, nice and thin. It's like a little kind of ovalish little bread. So I'm just gonna put that over there, and then you do that for the next one. And as you can see, it's a very sticky dough, so as it kind of gets stuck to your rolling pin, you don't want that, because it's gonna break it up. You're gonna just sprinkle it with a little flour to keep consistent. Okay, so we'll start with frying those two off. So So the next step for these, since these are skillet flatbreads, is to heat up your skillet. So you just want to grab just heavy bottom skillet, turn it up, and grab a dash of olive oil for it.
Do you have that on a low heat?
It's going to be about a medium heat for that. Okay. So when it comes to oil, the last thing you want to do is put your product in a cold oil pot. Does anyone know what happens when the oil in the pot is a little too cold for the item?
It'll like soak it up instead of frying it.
Yep, exactly. So if you don't let your oil get nice and hot, it's going to create an oily and kind of greasy product when you bite into it, as opposed to just searing that outer layer and gelatinizing those starches immediately. All right. So that's just getting hot. I always like to wait a little longer than I think it is because I tend to be bad at guesstimating how hot oil is. But a good way to tell too is if it's nice and shiny and it runs around the pan really quick, then you know that it's a very hot oil and that it should be all set to fry. All right, let's give a little test. Oops, see, I'm always just a little off. Does anybody have any questions about the frying or the rolling out of the dough? I know that process went kind of quick.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So would you consider this like, because you had mentioned naan and like kind of that rustic kind of flatbread thing, would you consider this like cooking method like more of like a fried dip or something more? I'm still like a little confused as to if you're like frying it.
No, it's just like a small layer of oil in the bottom of the pan. So I guess it's just, honestly, I probably don't even need it because this is a non-stick pan, but it gives it like that nice golden brown color, which is kind of what I like. So I guess it's more of just for that, just to accentuate that a little bit. But yeah, it's not more of like, because when it comes to fried dough, they just kind of like really dunk it in there. Like they do a deep fry as opposed to like, I guess this would be more so of like a pan fry or a skillet kind of method. So I can't really like lift it up, but you could see it starting to do its thing.
Oil that you shouldn't use, or besides olive oil, are better than others?
Well, when you think about it this way, this is going exactly onto your final product, and it's going to affect the flavor and taste of it. So I like to try to make sure I use like a better olive oil, let's say. Like this isn't the best olive oil out there. Obviously the best is in Italy, but I try to use something that has a little more of like a refined flavor to it, just so that it doesn't affect the taste of the final product. I'm not a huge fan personally of just like the store brand like vegetable oil for things like this. I feel like that's better for something like deep frying, like a French fry or something that you're gonna like put spices on and shake around. This one you kind of just serve as is. So
What are some things that you would pair your flatbread with?
would I pair this with? Honestly, these would be really nice for I think some little flatbread pizzas because they're nice and chewy and they have like just like that little crisp like in the thin crust that you'd like in that. So I do think that they would be good for something like that. Or even honestly, when I made them the first time I made this recipe, it just to eat them on their own. They were great. I really liked them.
Could you use like an infused or a flavored olive oil?
Oh yeah, that would be really good actually. So you're gonna see how this side just crisped up nice and golden over there.
Nice.
And then you're just gonna flip it over and let that other side cook. And it's so cool to watch them too. I wish I could tilt the pan over to show you. It doesn't like, it just kind of runs away. But they puff up. It's so funny. They just like go like that because of the rise of the baking powder in them. So while these are finishing up, if you could take a look at the, I have a worksheet that looks just like the recipe, except it has questions in it throughout, some things that we may have touched upon in this lesson. And if you'd like, you could just do a quick look over that. And if you have any questions about those, please let me know. But I think we touched on almost everything. All right, there he is. And we're just gonna grab the second one, and got a little hot, so we're gonna turn that down.
I have a question as far as just the mixing method.
Yep.
If like could this be done completely by hand, or the mixing mixer is necessary?
I don't think the mixer is necessary for this recipe. It's a relatively easy one. I did it for, I prefer starting it off in the mixer just to kind of get that first hydration and get everything really well incorporated, and then finish it off by hand. But you could definitely, this is definitely one that you could adapt to just do by hand. It's not a very difficult dough to make. It's not very like work heavy. Like sometimes you have a dough that's very low on hydration and you're really kneading into it. And I feel like this dough isn't that. It's just like a nice airy dough. So while this one's finishing up, we're gonna take a look at the final product so that we can talk about the crumb that is in the final product. Does anyone off the top of their head know what crumb is in regards to a baked good recipe? It's okay if not, because I haven't talked about it yet.
Like if it's tight, or like if it's dense and tight, or if it's more like airy and like you can bubbles and.
Yes, so that's one of the descriptors of a crumb, is either whether it's open or if it's a closed crumb. And basically what the crumb is referring to is that internalized texture of the dough, whether it was tender, whether it was flaky, open, closed. It's all of those descriptors for that, but it is the internalized texture of the dough. So we're just going to take this one, and we're going to break him open. And I don't know if you can see the crumb very well. I'm going to show the other phone too. But you can see that this recipe, it's cooked all the way through. You have, since it is a flatbread recipe, you're not going to have a very open crumb. You're going to have more of a tight knit kind of crumb. But you can see in there that it's very like flaky, a little tender, and that's kind of what you're looking for in this type of flatbread. So it's just that texture. And you can see that if you would like to break it apart by hand to say dip in a dip, like you would with naan or even marinara or something, you can just do like a nice little break with it, and it pulls apart relatively easily. So that's kind of the description of the crumb for this bread. When you're looking at the bread of a baguette as opposed to a bread like this, obviously it has more time for yeast to develop, it has more time to rise, and it does a lot more resting. There's highs and lows in it when you're resting or when you're working with it. So that one's gonna have a more developed overall crumb than this type of bread, which is a quick bread. All right, so at this time we can discuss the practical exam that is going to be for the next lesson in this class. Very similarly to what I have presented here today and demonstrated, we're going to be working in groups of 2 to either make a flatbread or some similar quick bread with a wheat flour. It can be a muffin, it can be a cookie, it could be something from your culture like I did for mine, like for Italian. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to work in groups of 2, and one person's going to make the recipe as is, and then we're going to play around a little bit with that recipe and choose one of the modifications of that bread. So either the liquid, the shortening or fat, the mixing method, or the type of flour to see how that affects it, and just do a basic research and presentation experiment with it. So for the final part of what we do today, we're going to do a closure with a Google form that I have shared with all of you. If you need help accessing it, it's also on the class website. And then once those results are in, we can go through the responses together to clarify anything else. So if you could just take a minute to fill that out while I clean up over here, that'd be awesome.
is that in our shared folder?
Yes, it's actually directly in the packet. It'll be all the way at the bottom.
Oh.
There should be a hyperlink for it. Was everybody able to find it okay?
No.
Oh no, okay, give me 1 minute.
Lesson 2 assessment.
Yes, it's that.
Yeah, click on the link.
Oh, I found it.
Okay, good.
It's not letting me click it.
You're in the PDF version of it? That's where it let me click.
Oh. Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah.
I was in the top.
All right, let's take a look at these responses. Oh, got 2 already. All right. All right, so looks like everybody has submitted that. We're going to take a look at the responses by question. So the first question is, which of the following are needed for proper development of gluten? And the options are wheat flour, water, agitation, and fat. So this one is a little bit of a trick question because fat, although it is oftentimes used in a wheat flour recipe, it is not needed for proper gluten development. All you need for proper gluten development is the flour that is made of wheat, because those contain the 2 proteins needed, the liquid, water, and just to agitate it together. Okay, so for the second question, which of the following, what is crumb? So the crumb, which everybody got, awesome, is the internal texture of a baked product. The third one, what test can be used to check gluten development in a wheat flour recipe? Window pane test, which everybody got correct as well, great. And then Chef Hallett mixes her dough as directed by the recipe, but it is still sticky. How can she remedy this? And the correct answer, add a dusting of flour to the dough and knead manually, which everybody got. And then the third one, which of the following are the proteins that contribute to gluten formation? 2 out of 3 answered glutenin and gliadin, and all 3 of you said gliadin. So yeah, so there are 2 of those proteins that are present in the wheat flour. They kind of work together to bond and elongate that gluten. So you need both glutenin and gliadin in the recipe. Now that we've gone over the assessment, does anybody have any questions in regards to any of the items touched upon in the assessment? Oh, pretty straightforward. Does anybody have any questions left unanswered about gluten or proper gluten development in general?
Can you taste the products for us?
Do you really want me to? I mean, I had it. Yeah, I mean, I could if you'd like. Yeah.
I'm hungry.
Are you? I could have rolled out 1 more dough. It looks like I had enough time to do a third. So basically, this is the second one that I cooked off. He's really pretty. Yep. So that one. So they're still warm, which is really nice in a bread. Although the flavor in bread doesn't fully develop until it's cool, actually. So you're not supposed to eat warm bread, you're actually supposed to eat it cooled. So for this one, it has, it's good actually. So you can see on the outside, it has that little dusting of flour still. So you kind of, when you bite into it, it kind of like breaks through that layer and does a little crunch in it. And then you have a nice tender center. And it's really nice and like chewy, very chewy, very good. And just a nice blank palette for anything that you'd like to put on it. Does anyone have any potential ideas for what they'd like to do for their 85-minute lesson plan, or something that this recipe reminded them of that they might be able to use?
I think changing up the fat, maybe trying like a different oil or.
I'm glad you mentioned that earlier, because I was like, oh, that would be such a perfect idea for the assessment, and she doesn't even know it yet. But yeah, definitely.
Rosemary would be nice on that.
Yeah, it would. Like a rosemary and avocado oil type of topping on it. Yeah, definitely, for sure. All right. Oh, if nobody has any questions, then I think we are all set for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.